Trouble logging in as a panelist. I'm going to see if I can get Victoria to at least be able to hear her.
We can talk, Sandy.
We can talk. Yes,
Yay.
we can. All right. Hooray. Thank you so much for your patience, everyone. Let me share a slide that Victoria wanted to start us off with, and I'll do some housekeeping things to kind of get us going. There we go. So, good evening. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Sandy Borden, the director of the Ethics Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you belatedly to our program tonight. Do we have a duty of moral attention? So just so you know, you will have an opportunity to put questions in the chat, and we'll get to those after we've had a chance to have a bit of a conversation. We are recording this program, so if you registered for the program, we'll be getting the link. We'll also be putting it on our YouTube channel. And those of you attending for signature credit, Western students, I'll be putting a link for attendance into the chat for you, as well as some resources in the chat about Victoria and her company Ethics² and the Ethics Center. So it's unfortunate that we cannot in fact see Victoria, but I would like to nevertheless make sure that you know all about her. She's a public speaker, a corporate trainer, consultant, and coach, focusing on ethics and professionalism. Her company, Ethics², offers ethics training and content for individuals and organizations to navigate today's complex world. She's a distinguished emeritus professor at Western Michigan University Cooley Law School, and for 10 years, she was the deputy division director and staff attorney to the Professional Standards Division of the State Bar of Michigan. I'm also proud to say that she's a board member of Western's Ethics Center. And this quote that I have up right now was kind of an inspiration for today's topic. And as far as I'm concerned, it really captures a sense of attention as kind of, headspace or bandwidth. We use that expression sometimes, or in Merriam-Webster's words, applying the mind to something. So it seems to me Victoria is suggesting that the way we use that headspace might have moral implications. Am I right?
Indeed. And Sandy, it's wonderful. I always love talking with you about these subjects. And I apologize to our attendees that for whatever reason the tech gremlins have struck tonight, and I'm not able to see you, you're not able to see me, but we're still going to have a wonderful conversation because Professor Borden is an amazing person, and I just love talking with her about really important issues. And I came across this quote about a year and a half ago from Viktor Frankl, who is a concentration camp survivor and a psychiatrist. And he wrote this amazing book that I highly recommend called Man's Search for Meaning. And this quote about the space in our brain between stimulus and response, I thought was very powerful, and it's really caused me to see the world very differently. And as Professor Borden says, this whole idea of this limited bandwidth that we have, this limited headspace that each of us have, and how do we use that? How do we protect it or not protect it? And it seems to me that it's two sides of a coin. Number one, what do we have a duty to pay attention to? And the flip side of that coin is, what do we have a duty to avoid paying attention to? Because we all know how, after almost 3 years of this pandemic, how exhausted we all are from being online and doom scrolling. And we've had our moral attention being tested now with the war against, and I refuse to say the war in Ukraine, because it's really a war on Ukraine. So there's my little political stance today. The war on Ukraine, coming close on the heels of the pandemic and the political and societal division in the United States. And many of us want to pay attention, but we are psychologically exhausted. And what do we do with that? And so, Professor Borden, tell me if you disagree, but I think our discussion tonight is about holding these two tensions. What does it mean to uh, uh, pay attention, to be an ethical citizen in the attention economy without doom scrolling ourselves into anxiety and helplessness? I know that sometimes I will leave my news feed thinking, oh my gosh, there's nothing I can do.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which, our cognitive capacity is a limited resource, right? We really can only devote so much headspace to things. And it seems to me there might be some decisions to make, as you suggest, right, that have moral implications. What do we choose to spend our attention on, which to me also means your energy and your time, right? Um, do we have an obligation, as you say, to pay attention to certain things? And in part because we have limited headspace and limited attention to devote to the things we should pay attention to, are there some things that we should just say, no, I'm not going to do that today, right? I'm not going to spend time doom scrolling today. I know I ration my doom scrolling. I bet many of our attendees do as well. And I think what we're trying to suggest today is that it's not only a matter of well-being and mental health, right? I think sometimes we discuss this topic in those terms, but it's also a matter of ethics.
That's right. And that's what has intrigued me as a lawyer. You can't be a good lawyer and not really care about process. And to the point that as a lawyer and with my training, particularly being an ethics attorney, I find that where you stand on the issues is secondary to a fair process. Because if you have a fair process and that everybody plays by the same rules, and the rules are, as we used to say as kids, even Steven, that
Yeah.
they're not um, tailored to give one side an advantage or not, then the policies usually take care of themselves because it forces people into, compromising. And so I've been very alarmed at what seems to me to be a dismantling of the rules. And as and so I've pondered this question of, okay, well, what do we do as everyday normal people? The one thing that we do have is our capacity to vote and our capacity as consumers. And those two things are much more powerful than people think. And I'm hoping that the 2020 election put to lie the notion that um, individual voters don't make a difference in election outcomes. And so I do think that we have, if you think of morals as individual values and ethics as the values of a system, we have our moral sense that is personal to each of us about where we stand on the issues. But I think I, I would argue, I just don't think, I would argue that we have a duty to be an ethical citizen and to determine what choices we make as consumers and as voters. What do you think, Professor
Yeah,
Borden?
totally. Absolutely. But I think, one of the things that we struggle with is whether, in fact, the process is even Steven, as you put it, right?
Mhm.
There's a long history of manipulation, both in politics and in advertising, right? And so even if we try to be good citizens and good consumers and invest our attention wisely, sometimes people take advantage of that. So what are some thoughts do you have about this in terms of your own work in this area? What kinds of ways have we been manipulated, you think?
Well, and I always love to talk about advertising, and you as with your communications background
Mhm.
have a lot to add to this. But I'm a big Mad Men fan. I don't know if
Oh,
anyone
right.
watch that show, and I do confess that it's a little nostalgic for me because I grew up in the 60s and the 70s, so it had particular resonance with me. But it's been interesting to see over the decades how business has tried to influence that space in our brain in terms of
Mhm.
how we spend our money. So when the astronauts started going to the moon, you know, everything like Tang and space food sticks, that was all the
I grew up a
rage.
Tang. Yep.
Right. And it's almost felt like this patriotic duty that we had to go buy Tang and space food sticks or whatever they were called. They probably didn't taste very good, but lots of us kids consumed them. Um, and so there was kind of that sense that I remember in that era. And it's been interesting now that there's a resurgence in the interest in NASA. I see a lot of
Mhm.
kids wearing NASA NASA emblems and logos, and I think that's really really awesome. So, you know, appealing definitely to our patriotic sense. And then, and correct me, I can't remember if it was the 80s or the 90s, the whole um, uh, dark um, uh, advertising where
The
there.
subliminal stuff. Yeah.
Yes, yes, thank you. I
Yeah.
was searching for
Yeah.
the term. The subliminal advertising where they were putting skulls and crossbones into ice cubes in liquor ads and uh, in print media, in cigarettes and these sorts of things. Uh, and I assume that the brain research at the time was that people would somehow be subliminally attracted to purchase these products. What do you know about that? And we seem to have moved on to a much different level from then.
Yeah, yeah, in a way that seems quaint today, doesn't it? I mean, it's like, wow, that you have to sit there, with your little microscope looking for these little hidden signs and ads. I mean, today they can target us so precisely, right? All they have to do is harvest our data. So much advertising is moved online, right, in the digital space. And you can get something that's exactly tailored to whatever searches you've been doing, whatever websites you've been visiting, right? Why mess around with the subliminal stuff when they can just get right directly to your psychological vulnerabilities by using your data against you?
Indeed, and it's when we'd watch network television occasionally and the ads that are on cable, and I always
Mm.
have to, I get a little puzzled and I get a little chuckled around the holidays with the Buick commercials, where people come out of their house and here's this beautiful Buick automobile with a great big red bow on
Oh,
it.
right.
And I just have to laugh. I look at my husband and say, "When are you going to buy me a car for Christmas?" I don't know anybody who buys a car and puts it in the driveway with a big bow. If you've ever been the recipient of that, any of our attendees, good for you. But I think that's maybe a good example of mass advertising that, unlike the pinpointed advertising that you're marketing that you're talking about, Professor Borden, that can only move a few people. Um, but perhaps I'm wrong about that. But I always chuckle at that
Yeah,
ad.
I don't know. I mean, I have to say, I'm not sure because I think so much advertising has moved to the digital space, and it is so easy to micro-target people. I guess I don't know for sure. Maybe some of our attendees have background in this area, but my sense is actually that it's pretty effective, right?
Hmm.
That's why so much advertising has moved away, for example, moved away from newspapers and obviously the television networks, right? I mean, we have very fractured media ecology now. The one place where you're going to reach your target audience is in the digital space. And the reason you're going to reach your target audience is because of the way the data is used. I mean, you mentioned earlier this idea of the attention economy, right? This basically highlights the fact that so much today is based on us being the product, right? I mean, if you're having to do a mass advertising campaign to sell Buicks, You don't know how many people who watch your ad are going to go and buy a car and put a bow on it for Christmas. But if you're able to micro-target, right, that gives you a lot more certainty that you're reaching the customer that's maybe more likely to do that. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's an interesting idea, you know, about this being a product, right? Which means actually our
Yes.
attention's worth money, actual money. In fact, there's some reformers that are suggesting that one way to reform the digital space and the business models of the Facebooks and the other platforms is for us to actually be paid for our data. Because they're
Oh,
using our data, right? I mean, and they're making money off of us. We're the product, right? So our attention, our eyeballs, I mean, that's actually what they're buying, these advertisers. So yeah, we should invest that attention wisely.
yes. And that's an intriguing notion that we should be paid for it. And that gets right back to what is that value of that
Mhm.
space in our heads between stimulus and response. I would
Mhm.
argue that it's very precious. And we give that space away, most of us, fairly willingly and without a lot of forethought. And it does seem to be an ethical question that if we are being manipulated and we're definitely the target and the currency, we should be paid for that. And that goes right along with the privacy too, the right to be forgotten. And I'm
Mhm.
heartened to see some of the European nations move forward on that right to be forgotten.
Yeah, I think that's a really intriguing thing. It's many Americans recoil at that idea, but it's an interesting concept, right? And actually it goes back to this notion that individuals own their own data and they ought to be able to have control over their data. So even if it's originally collected for a legitimate purpose, if it's no longer being used for the purpose for which it was collected, right, or it's become irrelevant or so forth, then you have the option, right, the right to withdraw your data. It's interesting. They think of data very differently in Europe than we do. So,
Mhm.
but I want to kind of go back to politics.
Sure.
You know, one of the things that we talked about when we were kind of brainstorming for this session was how outrage is used to get us to consume more extreme political content. Is
Yes,
that?
I've been fascinated by the work of Dr. Jean Kim, who has done extensive research on anger and outrage. And she posits that anger and outrage are addicting. They actually light the pleasure centers of our brain. And interestingly, there's a moral component to this because outrage makes us feel morally superior, that we somehow believe that we are on the right edge of things. And and we it gives us permission to, in a sense, dehumanize and not listen to opposing viewpoints because we have it right. We have morals on our side. um, it's also a tool of avoidance because if you think you're morally superior, in most people's mind, that ends the analysis. They don't have to confront the moral complications of our own position. And I like I enjoy reading the work of David French. David French is a uh, moderate conservative, Christian conservative, who comes at politics with a definite Christian, conservative Christian viewpoint. But he argues the point that we never have, most of us, and particularly he's very critical of his um, colleagues on the right who are Christian and very involved in the church, but they avoid taking responsibility. They avoid exploring the tensions, the contradictions between their faith and their political actions and belief.
Interesting. Yeah, I just think this is a really rich area to explore, right? Because you know, we now know that these apps and platforms we use are actually not addictive incidentally. They're addictive on purpose, right?
Right.
So the Facebook whistleblower, right, who was testified before Congress recently. I mean, she pointed out that look, it's like it's not a bug, right? It's a feature, and it's engagement, regardless of what that engagement consists of, right? So, even if it's really extremist content, and if it's content that polarizes our society, if it's content that discourages people from voting, if it's that's fine as long as again they have your eyeballs, because yes, you and I are the product.
Yes. And it's interesting, was it Google or Facebook whose motto was do no harm?
Yeah. Don't be evil. Yes, I
Don't
think
be
it's
evil.
Google. Yeah. Too
Don't
late.
be evil. Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting industry to analyze from the get-go in terms of what steps did they take and what compromised their ethics over the years to just make it a pure profit driven endeavor. In my mind, I think that Wall Street and Silicon Valley share a lot of ethical qualities. And
Oh, boy.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, but as you mentioned, Sandy, this is having huge consequences for our society. So as the
Mhm.
Facebook whistleblower indicated, their algorithms are harming young women. They are harming the psychological well-being of citizens and their customers, and it's tearing us apart
Mhm.
politically. And the other thing that I think is very interesting is that somehow we have moved past the point in the political realm of compromise, that
Mhm.
suddenly compromise has become a bad thing. And it's now winning is equated with domination and even destruction. And this is very concerning because building something that will last, building something of value is an incredibly hard endeavor. It requires cooperation, it requires communication, it's slow, it's inefficient, but the end product is always going to be better than something and it, that is just destructive. It's easy to tear down. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts?
I agree. And I think, even outside of the realm of politics, I do think sometimes when we think about what it means to be ethical, we think of it as, I am not going to budge on my convictions, right?
Hmm.
But there are ways to be, to compromise ethically, right? Yes, I mean, of course you should not, commit to solutions that compromise your values in awful ways, right? I mean, you don't want to, you're not going to assent to evil, right?
Right.
But there are ways to come up, I think, with they're not going to be perfect solutions, right? I mean, I do think that's one of if you have an all or nothing attitude, compromise probably will not work, right? So you're not going to get everything you want, and the other person's not going to get everything they want. But somewhere right there in the middle, I mean, there are things that are valuable that you both can agree on and that are worth pursuing together. I mean, I think that's, a sense of ethical compromise, right? You're not gonna be able to get everything, but what's the saying? Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? I mean, it
Right.
might be better to get, something good rather than nothing good, right? Or something evil, right? I mean, there are ways I think to work it where people can agree to compromises in good conscience, right? Not just as kind of some bad, settling, but really kind of moving the needle, right, in a positive direction by agreeing to things that you both value that are good. That kind of compromise, that seems to me, is worthwhile and maybe not appreciated as much as it could be.
Yes. When I was a brand new green lawyer, my very first job was in Owasso, Michigan, a small
Uh-huh.
town uh, between Flint and Lansing.
Mm,
And I wandered into the law office of my mentor. And at that time, he was 65 and contemplating
mm,
retirement. And I remember that we were coming back from the courthouse and we had a case, a really big, a wrongful death case that settled on the courthouse steps, as they say in the legal profession. And I was kind of quiet, and he asked me, he said, well, Victoria, what's bothering you? And I said, well, Clark, how do you know when you have a good settlement? How do you know when, I would not want to sell out the client, but usually settling is better than fighting, except, in rare circumstances. And I'll never forget what he said, because I thought it was such a great touchstone for life. And he said, Victoria, he said, you know that you have a good settlement, you know that you have a good compromise when everybody hates it, but everybody can live with it. And that seems to me a decent metaphor, that nobody likes it, but we can live with it.
Yeah, but see, doesn't that go against that sense of moral outrage that you were describing before? You can't have moral outrage if you think the only way to be on on the high ground is your way, right?
Right.
Because then by definition, right, if you're not liking the compromise, it seems like somehow you've kind of given up some moral ground as well as maybe some political ground or some power or something like that. So I mean, I think you're right that this idea that that somehow a sense of kind of self-righteousness maybe is pervasive in political discourse today is really damaging to the kinds of ethical compromises we might assent to, right, as responsible citizens. But it also occurs to me in some of the advertising examples, you know, that they manipulate our values, right? I mean, the sense in
True.
which ads often go after, things that we ought to value. I mean, going back to the Buick commercial idea and, giving your significant other something they would love. I mean, it seems like giving somebody you love something good. I mean, what's wrong with that? Okay, that's great.
Right.
But at the point where they're, using it in a way to kind of, it can psychologically manipulate you, right? Then we have, so the only good present I can get for my significant other has to be like a car. I mean, that makes me think of, I've noticed this in the last 2 or 3 years, this idea of winning Christmas. Have you seen that in the commercials? And
No.
winning, oh yeah, check it out. There's a lot of them. It's like, we're gonna, how do you win Christmas, right? It's like this competitive thing where the family members are like, let's see who's gonna really like, who's got the best gift, right? Was it grandma? Was it mom? Was it dad? I mean, who won Christmas? This puts a lot of pressure on people, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and it seems to make Christmas all about competing with each other, with your loved ones about who's going to, get the better, present for somebody. Again, it seems like they're taking something that might be good, but they're manipulating it in a way that actually maybe makes us develop either values that are not so good, right? Or somehow compromise the good values we might possess. So yes, so I guess, instead of values, sometimes I like to think in terms of virtues, right?
Yes.
And, it seems like part of what we're dealing with here is a kind of an environment in which there's a lot of emphasis on convenience and instant gratification, right? I mean, part of the reason they get us to engage on these terms, especially in the digital space, is because it's just so easy to scroll. Just keep scrolling, and you look up and you spend 2 hours doing that, and it's really easy to, there's an app for that, right? To just, yes, I want that now. Actually, I do this a little bit on my Kindle. I never thought I would read on a Kindle, but now that I'm used to it, and when I get to reading a series, and then it pops up, would you like to read the next book in the series? And I'm like, yes, I you know but how much are we giving up for the sake of convenience and instant gratification, and is becoming conditioned to having everything now because I want it conducive to developing virtues?
It is not. And
Right
you're in
answer.
the
Yes.
right. No, it's very concerning to me. You are exactly right. That has gone to the point where it's in the old days, it used to be, okay, well, we're going to influence you to buy this product. If you smoke these cigarettes or you drive this car, you too are going to be perceived as this, sexy, appealing, powerful person. Well, now, as you rightfully pointed out, they're manipulating our values, which is the reason why I don't know about winning Christmas is because I go into a blackout at Christmas.
You, do
And
you abstain?
I
Mhm.
confess to being a bit of a Scrooge because of the whole gift giving thing and the
Ah, right.
horrific news on Black Friday, because Christmas is about relationships. It's about being
Mm-hmm.
together, and it's about celebrating the beautiful and amazing magical connection of human beings and what can flow from that. And so I'm Scrooged, believing that the whole gift giving, going above board is counterproductive to
Mm-hmm.
that. And the all ethics and morals involve a balance of at least two or more competing interests. And we drive ourselves crazy at Christmas. Like you said, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to have the house decorated perfectly and to come up with a perfect meal and to get the perfect gifts, which I think we lose sight of what's important, what's really important and what Christmas is about. And this extends over into the political realm because the political parties and their PACs and the voting industry, the election industry, has very successfully made politics one of our values. So the political party that we identify with or affiliate with, people view that now as an important part of them. They feel that's part of their values. When you and I are old enough to remember the days when if you were with mixed company, you didn't talk, what is it, politics, sex, and religion.
Religion. Yeah.
And so we've been very intentional about cultivating. We know we have friends who we probably wildly differ in terms of the political outlook, and we don't talk about it. Or if we talk about it, we talk about it very respectfully and very limitedly because we value the friendship more than we value identifying with a certain set of values that political parties and those that benefit from us trying to adopt this personal identification of political values when
Mm-hmm.
it's really only one facet of who we are as people.
Mm-hmm. So they've succeeded, in other words, in kind of selling us something, right? As you say,
Mhm.
kind of our political affiliation as a kind of value that ought to supersede all kinds of other values, and that doesn't seem quite right. Um, yeah, so again, I'm kind of going back to what you said early on in the conversation about the kind of two sides of the coin, right? So what should we pay attention to? What do we have a duty to pay attention to? And what should we avoid paying attention to? So on the one hand, it seems like we should pay attention to politics, at least in some sense, so maybe not as partisan warfare, right? I mean, I think that's kind of the problem. It's like now that seems to be the way that we're invited to attend to politics, right? That doesn't seem like a healthy way to attend to politics. And then there's some things that we should avoid. I think I heard you saying you'd like to avoid some of the messaging around Christmas in terms of that kind of a consumerist orientation. Um, I think that's interesting, right? Because I think so much of what we're talking about is baked into our daily life, right? I mean, many
Yes.
people start their day, right, on their phone, checking their messages, again, doom scrolling. We're exposed to advertising 24/7, and politics, right? The rhetoric just surrounds us completely. It can be really hard to pull back and kind of be a kind of a conscientious objector, right? Like you are around about Christmas. Like, sorry, I'm not playing, right? How do you remain involved, right, in healthy ways without being consumed by, literally consumed by consumption, consumed by this whirlwind, right? That is trying to hold our attention hostage in ways that are not conducive to being good, ethical people and ethical citizens. I mean, do you have any strategies other than not watching TV around Christmas time?
Well, I get back to how lawyers look at things. And lawyers, good lawyers, look at systems. And
Okay.
and if you think of, and this is why I found the Viktor Frankl quote so empowering, when I realized that, okay, there's this space in my brain and it's very small and it's very delicate, but it's very powerful at the same time. I started to see how the systems were trying to manipulate that space, either to get me to buy things or to get me to vote or feel a certain way, or as we talked about, identify, make something part of my moral and ethical identity. And if you can view life from a systems perspective, it gives you a little space where you can say, okay, I have this advertising and look how cute that decoration is, or that sheet set, or the workout outfit. I want that. And as human beings, we're hardwired for consumption and instant gratification. But then we talk about, okay, well, what am I giving up? What is the countervailing value? What is the countervailing interest? Because all ethics issues, moral issues involve a competition between two or more competing interests. And so to look at it from a systems point of view, and then because if we don't protect that space in our brain, we're not free. We're the subject. We are held hostage by um, actors trying to get us to spend our money, by political parties and their PACs, whoever, uh, the misinformation campaigns of Russia and China and other actors. So the digital diet, the idea of curating what we put into that space. Now, I'm sorry, I've talked a lot. What are your thoughts on this?
No, I mean, I agree. I mean, I know I make intentional decisions every day about where I'm going to get my news, and to some degree how much time I'm going to spend reading news. And I'm like you, I tend to be rather dismissive of commercials, I confess. And because I think I'm just kind of aware of, there's a sense in which I know they're trying to manipulate me. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. Again, I think of this every day to some degree, though I'm sure I could do better. And there's some things I just choose not to partake in at all. Um, Facebook being an example. I've never been on Facebook, nor do I intend to be. But the minute I say this, I realize that cuts me off from certain things, right? It cuts me off from certain people who have migrated to Facebook and no longer will send, individual emails or cards or things like that, because they just kind of want to broadcast everything to everybody at the same time. So there's always cost, I think, in not participating in the day's, milieu, right? Whatever is kind of the going thing. So I'm sure that I'm missing out on some level. And so I think every decision, right, about trying to curate, right, our attention and our diet in terms of what we devote our energy and time to has benefits, but also some costs. And I think for some people, the costs are high enough where they are like, well, I'm just going to do the best I can, right? Um, I a few years ago, I was teaching a media class to my students, and this is not atypical. This kind of the media fasting, right? Where you're like, you can't use anything for 24 hours. And actually, I think I only made them do it for like 7 hours. I wasn't even that tough. And then they had to write a reflection paper about it. And I literally had like, I don't know, 2 or 3 students out of a class of 30 that said something along the lines of, I didn't know what to do with myself because I couldn't use any of my media. So I stayed in bed all day.
Oh,
So I mean, so like to you and me, that's like, really, like you couldn't think of anything to do that. But for me, but depending on how plugged in you are, right? And then the follow-up exercise was there was software you can use on your laptop that will record, all the different windows you have open at any given time. So I said, record yourself for an hour, right? And so students found that even though they were supposedly working on a paper, of course they weren't, right? Because they were like they had 15 tabs open and they were talking on their phone, they were doing all this other stuff, right? The myth of multitasking.
Mm.
Um, so so anyway, I think you and I can talk a good game, but the reality is we probably don't do nearly as well as we think we do, and it can be pretty hard, I think, to step away from the kind of environment in which, again, we have platforms and apps with addictive qualities, right? They know how to get those pleasure centers fired up. We have, fear of missing out, right? All of those social pressures to kind of be in the know. And just kind of the ease of entertainment. I mean, people can't even, stand in line at the grocery store without pulling out their phone to do something instead of just waiting, pondering. Dare I say, be bored. Um, and I think for people who care about ethics, that can be problematic. And there's actually some research that shows that our brains are rewired, by using the internet, at least in certain ways. And it can affect focus and concentration and a word that we love in ethics, reflection, right? I mean, if you're never
Mhm.
kind of like in a quiet space, right? That headspace, if that headspace is always just full of noise, how do you reflect
Yes.
on those values that you were talking about, right? In order to really ponder what it is that you should care about and how you should even start to make these choices.
Well, you used the key term there when you were talking about your students and their experience and how you and I do think we're probably a little better at this than the average bear and that we're not being realistic.
Yeah,
I know I struggle with it, which is this stuff is addicting, is
yeah,
designed to addict us. And so just like any other addictive substance, whether that's alcohol or tobacco or drugs, I think we need to treat it with the same sort of wariness. And the problem is that most of us have to work and do our work on these devices
yeah,
where we're intentionally bombarded, whereas many of us aren't faced with alcohol when we go to work, or we're not faced with
right.
drug use or tobacco. So it is incredibly hard. And
Mm-hmm.
that the articles that you sent about the rewiring the brain chemistry, I think
Mm-hmm.
our viewers might be really interested in that if we could put that link in the
Ooh,
chat.
I'm gonna have to find that link.
Oh, okay. Well, I
You
think
keep
part of
talking. I'll look for the link.
okay. And the um, surveillance capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
the extent and the sophistication of these efforts is pretty scary.
It's
Um,
mind-boggling. Yeah.
but I think you what you're talking about is we talked about bandwidth and just the normal everyday space in our head, but what we underlying that is the practical wisdom. Do we have an ethical duty here, which is um, the practical wisdom that Aristotle talked about, and I, that can be a very powerful tool. So one of the things that I try to do when I'm curating news stories, when I'm curating big concepts and ideas, is okay, well, what is the end game here? If this philosophy that this party is espousing plays to its logical end, what is that going to be?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think our society has lost the capacity, and we as individuals, to a certain extent, have lost the capacity to hold the tension between two competing concepts, that two things can be true at once. And I'm very heartened. I'm holding high hopes for the younger generations, because they seem to be much more comfortable with gender fluidity and not and accepting and embracing that a person can be both male and female at the same time. And why I like that is that it's a great representation that life is complex and that two opposing things can be true at the same time. And that doesn't necessarily mean that one of them is wrong. And that's something that I wish we would cultivate more in our society. And it's something that I'm working on in myself. Um, particularly as people who are analytical by training and disposition, we tend to judge things a lot.
Yeah, yeah. But I really like that point though, because I think, one of the traditional aims of ethics education is to help people be more comfortable with ambiguity, right? I mean,
Mhm.
one of the reasons that people sometimes struggle with studying ethics is because they're like, I just want the answer. It's funny because my daughter, every once in a while she'll pop into my office and say, okay, ethics professor, like, here's one for you, right? And she's like, I hate asking you questions because you always like have this, it depends, it's complicated and give me all these sides. And I'm like, but like that's what you're supposed to do. Like you're supposed to think it all through, right? There's not some pat answer. I'm like, if there's a pat answer, you don't have an ethical dilemma, right? You just do the right thing and move on. Ethical problems are gray by nature, and some are more gray than others. But I just think it's so comforting for us to think in black and white terms, but I just don't think that's reality. And I do find often when I'm having conversations about contentious issues that people are just like, well, here, point one, and I'm like, okay, I mean, point two could also be true though at the same time. But I think people struggle with that, right? I mean, and I always say, I'm the both and person. I mean, and maybe that's a cop out. I don't know. Maybe I'm just kind of overcomplicating everything. It's quite possible. But I don't know. I think there's a lot of wisdom in seeking that both and. Because life is complicated. There's usually not a pat answer. If you're really struggling and stuck, it's because probably there's a lot of gray.
Yes, Father Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan priest, a liberal, very liberal Franciscan
Mm,
priest, writes a lot about that and talked
mm,
about how the message that uh, Jesus and the New Testament really brought was a rejection of that either or, that it's both
mm,
and.
mhm,
And
mhm,
he has a daily newsletter, a free newsletter that um, I recommend for anybody, regardless of your faith, because he talks about really interesting issues.
mm,
And uh, the email today, well, all of this week, he's talking about how whatever word you want to put on it, God, Buddha, the
mm.
the sustaining life force of the universe is both male and female. And and that's been really interesting to ponder that, because we live in a society, and I think a lot of societies where whatever name you use for that sustaining life force in the universe is male, traditionally male. But
Yeah.
yeah, I'm digressing there. So um,
No, but there's a lot there, and actually I wanted to maybe we can kind of wrap things up by kind of going back to your point about this idea of practical wisdom, right? Which is kind of this virtue, is kind of coordinating virtue in Aristotle, where it's kind of how you're able to kind of size up the situation and kind of and figure out what's going on, right, and all that its different dimensions and how to actually act in that situation in a virtuous manner. I mean, that's another kind of moral attention or moral awareness, right?
mhm.
And it's something that we can develop, we can cultivate, but it's again difficult to do that if we don't exercise some discipline. I don't know who said this honestly, but I really like it. I repeat it to myself on an almost daily basis. Discipline is the difference between what you want now and what you want most.
Oh,
Um, And I think that's helpful for thinking about cultivating the virtues, right? I mean, if you want to get good at being moral, there's no quick fixes, right? There's no shortcuts. You kind of got to do the work. And part of that is knowing what to pay attention to, what not, right? How to kind of conserve your moral powers in a way, right? So that you can deploy them, right? And invest them in responsible ways.
That's right. That's right. And we have become so, and I am not alone. I am a big offender of this, is
Mm-hmm.
the Amazon lifestyle. It's so amazing to just hit a few buttons and everything you
Yeah.
need will just come. But
Yep.
anything that's worth having is worth working for. And we come to our ethical and moral development by getting it wrong. And if we're
Yeah.
never
A
able
lot.
to, a lot, and that's that wisdom. That's why ideally we have older people that we turn to as mentors, because they've walked the path and they um,
Mm-hmm.
have made mistakes, and we can learn a lot from our mistakes. It's how we grow. So when we don't work, when we just adopt what these actors in the marketplace are trying to fill the space in our brains with, we we don't ever grow. We don't grow ethically, we don't grow morally, and we don't grow intellectually. And you're exactly right. It's very hard. It takes a great deal of self-awareness. And but it's hugely important if we want to preserve uh, the values of our society. And I do, that being said, that sounds very critical and doom and gloom. But again, I want to point out the young people that I've seen are that when we can get away from the online platforms, uh, they're amazingly wonderful at solving problems and caring for people. And I find the young people to be a values-driven generation, uh, and that many of them are very aware of what these platforms do. So I
Mm-hmm.
still, to end it on a positive note, and I'm eager to hear what your thoughts are. I have a lot of faith, despite all of the actors and manipulation that goes on and trying to change our values. I still have a great deal of faith in human nature, human beings coming together on a very granular basis to solve problems and care for each other. And we've seen what has happened with the EU countries taking in the Ukrainian refugees. It's very heartening.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously, I think we're seeing every day the capacity for evil among humans, but the capacity for good. And again, I really liked this topic in terms of thinking about um, kind of like the prerequisite for good moral action, right? This idea of attention, and I think sometimes we just undervalue of that headspace, right, that we started out with. I think you're right. That quote really brings it home. It's precious real estate there, and we can use it wisely or we can squander it, right?
Yes.
So I'd like to hear from our attendees. I've been trying to keep an eye on the chat. Paul says he ate those space sticks.
Yay,
So,
Paul.
so yeah, yeah, right. But yeah, feel free, guys. Those of you who are maybe have some questions for us to put those in the chat. And if you'd like to um, raise your hand, I can also unmute you if you'd like to just ask your question orally. I'm just gonna go through the chat here real fast to make sure I didn't miss anybody. I did put a couple of links there regarding some of the topics that we talked about, surveillance capitalism, and this idea that the internet may be rewiring our brains. So we have a question. Tafia Tafik Ali, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your name correctly, so forgive me in advance. Again, I'm glad to unmute if you'd like to ask your question orally, but I'll read it in the meantime. Interested in your thoughts about rule-governed behavior and how closely linked or not it is with morality and ethics. There is certainly a tradition that being ethical means following certain rules, as in Kant, and arguably it has the benefit of conserving attentional resources. Nice point. At the same time, it seems to fail in areas of ambiguity. Yeah, that's a great question. What do you think, Victoria? Oops.
Sorry about that. Old habits to mute myself.
Get unmuted.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, well, it's wonderful that Tawfiq is here. Hello, Tawfiq. And
Oh, you know, okay, great.
I do. He's a wonderful person and a
Wonderful.
wonderful lawyer,
Yes.
and he's a deep thinker and very thoughtful.
Mm.
And you're right. He's absolutely right that there's very little ambiguity, and and I'm sorry, sophistication. And people want easy solutions to complex problems, and the problems that we face in the world today are extremely complex. And and that's why I think our political parties, many of our political leaders are failing us ethically on both sides of the aisle, because they're reducing these complex issues to sound bites, to trying to, get them to fit on Twitter. And we need nuance, and we need to have these things explained in a complex way. And I have faith that the American public can understand that. But we have this machinery out there that is not constructed for nuance and complexity. I don't know if that is responsive to your question, Tawfiq.
And
How
Tafik,
about,
if you want to, I can unmute you if you'd like to address that.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah, we
yes.
can.
Oh, hi. Well, thank you for answering my question. Really excited to hear your talk, Victoria, and I think you did. I think you got it. The idea I had in mind is that uh, you're asking us, what does attention have to do with morality, right?
Exactly.
And to some extent, where we are today is our attention is being grabbed at from all directions, right?
Mhm.
We have attention overload. So we do need some sorts of heuristics or shortcuts to make good decisions, whether ethical or otherwise. At the same time, the world is becoming a more ambiguous place, or at least our understanding of what is right and wrong sometimes becomes more ambiguous. So I'm sort of trying to deal with that dilemma there, that paradox.
Okay, well, I can share some of the things that I do and that I have recommended to my students over the years. And the first one is to be skeptical of anyone or any organization that uses fear, hate, or anger to manipulate you. So if you're reading something and it's clear that that, that that if you're reading this and you're getting very angry at someone you don't even know, um, then and that they're using that to say, well, get out and vote or give us money or go buy our product, that's a big red flag. That and I just automatically move away or delete those emails. The other thing is to be humble. And so when we talk about, what I always try to ask myself is, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong about my position? So I believe that climate change is a real threat and that we have to do something about this very quickly. But I have to ask myself, okay, well, what if I'm wrong? What about the financial and societal cost and disruption that this may cause if I'm wrong? And that will automatically move someone to a more nuanced approach, a more centered approach, where, as Professor Borden and I were talking about, compromise can be made, because all change and all progress is usually done incrementally. And people, it's kind of funny when people complain about the inefficiency of the government, the federal government. Well, it was never designed to be efficient. There are good reasons for that. So uh, so that those are two key tools that I try to use. But I bet you have some, Tafik. What do you use?
I think you really got it. I think it's fear that you got to really watch out for. You know, the kinds of emotions that can hook you and really are sticky.
Mhm.
That's a good word for it.
Mm.
Um, they keep us from being open to the various arguments that might be relevant to an issue. Yeah. And to the extent that other people are using those things to manipulate us, and they are, uh,
Mhm.
maybe the first line of defense is to be aware of that. That that kind of agenda is out there, and frankly, even if there was an agenda, humans are susceptible to that.
I like that.
Yeah, I do too. So Tafik, was part of your question having to do with just the place of rules in ethics more generally, right? This idea that, why start from scratch every time when you can use a rule? I mean, doesn't that conserve our attention? And isn't that a good thing in the context of this conversation?
Oh, sure. And I think I also point out Kant, and he might say, well, the whole point of morality is to follow rules or
Right, right. You could
certain
actually even
types of
reduce
rules.
it to rule
Yeah.
following. Yeah.
Right.
Obviously,
That other
yeah,
motivations aren't even valid. When it
yeah,
comes to
yeah.
morality, the only motivation that counts is following a certain rule. Now, granted, it's formulated a certain way. The rule's got to meet certain conditions.
Hmm.
Uh, I think it's fair to say Kantianism doesn't help us practically solve a lot of issues on a
No.
day-to-day basis.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. I mean, I talk to my students about this, of course, right? I mean, what do you do with rules? And it seems like rules are useful, but we wouldn't want to just throw them out for no reason. They do serve that heuristic purpose that you were talking about. But on the other hand, we don't want to reduce morality to rules. And of course, when you do reduce morality to rules, and you see this sometimes, I think, in the professions, right, where often, ethics means compliance, right? Compliance with like a code or something like that. That when you consult a code, even a really good code, it only goes so far in telling you how to resolve the practical problem that you're actually facing right on the ground. I mean, that's where that, as you say, rules are not great with ambiguity. I mean, rules still have to be interpreted. And so then what are you relying on, right? You can't rely on the rule anymore at that point. Anyway, I think that's a really interesting question in terms of thinking about how to ration our moral attention.
I think another interesting thing about rules is that some people would consider that as sort of a glue, right? If we can all agree on the same rule, then
Right.
we can all be united, at least in some fashion.
Hmm.
But like you said, not only can we not agree on the same rules, we can't even agree on what the rules mean
Mean,
if
exactly,
we agree on them.
exactly. That's right.
Aside from the question of whether you can even develop rules that really dictate what you should be doing on a moment-to-moment basis. But
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a great point. Are there any other questions? I don't see anything else in the chat. Again, I'm happy to unmute you if you'd like to raise your hand. Let us know if you'd like to jump in. And you should be able to find the raise your hand icon at the bottom of your screen. It's just a little hand. Actually, I think, let's see, unmute all. Okay. Anything else that you want to bring up, Victoria, then before we
I'm good.
Jim?
I really enjoyed listening to your thoughts as always. And Tafik, he always has something very interesting and profound to point out.
So we were right to give him our attention, is what you're saying.
Yes, yes. And I
Yeah,
think that there might be some other people in the audience that I know
I
that I
bet.
would also put it on really great people to pay attention to and who will help us protect that very important space in our heads.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And we appreciate your attention tonight. Thanks for spending this time with us. And again, apologies that we had a late start today because of those technical gremlins. They were trying to interfere with our attention, but we won in the end. Here we are. So again, thanks so much for joining us. And thanks again, Victoria, for suggesting this topic and spending this time with us.
Well, thank you, everyone. And I enjoyed being here. And again, I'm sorry that I can't see you and you can't see me.
You're more mysterious that way.
Well, there you go.
There you go. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. Take care and have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you. Sandy?